North Atlantic, somewhere west of Ireland, early 1943. Midnight sits heavy over the convoy. The horizon has vanished into a wall of cloud, and the sea is running hard from the southwest, lifting the merchant columns in slow, uneven heaves. On the Escort's bridge, the red night lamps revealed strained faces, salt-streaked coats, and a chart pinned beneath gloved hands. Every few moments, a gust of spray lashes across the voice pipes and freezes in the wind. The astic beat pulses through the hull, steady, empty, offering no comfort. HFDF bearings taken earlier in the evening still hang in the captain's mind. Several short U-boat transmissions. Scattered across the convoy's starboard quarter, a Wolfpack is closing. Somewhere out there, on the surface, in the dark, their lookouts are watching the faint silhouettes of merchant masts rise and fall against the night. A single radar contact flickers on the set, indistinct, then gone, lost in the troughs. The captain studies the sea, the wind, the convoy's vulnerable alignment. He knows the U-boats have fixed the convoy's course, building their approach around its rhythm. That he closes the chart, steadying himself against the roll. The decision ahead will look reckless, even crazy. But the mathematics of survival leave little choice. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had settled into a grim, unbroken rhythm, a struggle fought across thousands of miles of ocean, where weather, technology, endurance, and mathematics mattered as much as gunnery or torpedoes. For Britain, this was not simply a naval campaign. It was the nation's lifeline. Every calorie, every drop of fuel, every aircraft part, every tank component, every spool of copper wire depended on ships that crossed the Atlantic in long, vulnerable columns. German strategy recognized this weakness with unflinching clarity. Under Admiral Karl Dönitz, the U-boat arm had developed a system designed to overwhelm individual convoys, the Rudel, the Wolfpack. It relied on patience and coordination. U-boats patrolled in long lines, sometimes stretching 100 miles or more. A single sighting, usually at dusk or in early night, triggered a contact report to the U-boat command. Other boats were then steered toward the convoy, converging silently beneath the horizon. The decisive blow came during darkness, when U-boats surfaced, used their diesels for speed, and attacked from multiple directions. Britain had seen the consequences in earlier years. In the bleak months of late 1940 and early 1941, convoys like SC-7 and HX-79 were torn apart in coordinated night attacks. Ships burned on the horizon while escorts, too few and too lightly equipped, could not be everywhere at once. The Royal Navy's response was swift but not immediate enough. The nation had to absorb the losses while rebuilding the escort fleet. By mid-war, however, the picture had shifted. Western Approaches Command, restructured under Admiral Sir Max Horton, created a system of defense that combined intelligence, technology, and training. HFDF stations along the British coast plotted the bearings of U-boat transmissions. Bletchley Park, working behind locked doors, decrypted substantial portions of German naval traffic. Long-range aircraft, though still limited, began to appear more frequently over the convoy routes. Yet even with these advantages, the mid-ocean remained perilous. Air cover could not reach far enough to blanket the gap. That stretch of water between Newfoundland and the British Isles where land-based aircraft could not operate for long. Here, the U-boats remained powerful, and here the Wolfpacks focused their efforts. This was the arena faced nightly by escort groups, small collections of destroyers, corvettes and later frigates, fanned out around dozens of merchant ships. Their task was brutally simple. They had to keep the convoy together. They had to maintain a screen that could detect, deter, and disrupt the U-boat. And above all, they had to prevent chaos. A merchantman that strayed from station became a straggler, and stragglers rarely survived in this environment. The judgment of an escort captain carried extraordinary weight. Technology offered warning, a faint radar return, a fleeting HFDF bearing, but it did not guarantee safety. The pack often slipped through the gaps. When that happened, the escort leader had seconds to decide how to reshape the convoy's defense. Course alterations were the most powerful tool available. A convoy that continued steadily on its original heading became predictable. Wolfpacks built their entire attack geometry on such predictability. But course changes carried danger. A modest alteration spread through the convoy like a slow ripple. A sharp turn passed through it like a shock. In heavy seas, columns could lose alignment. In darkness, a ship steering incorrectly might swing across another's bow. For the escort group, a sudden maneuver meant racing to re-establish the screen before the U-boats exploited the confusion. Nevertheless, wartime experience reinforced by countless tactical games at the Western Approaches. Tactical unit in Liverpool demonstrated that a radical turn, executed at the right moment, could be decisive. Turn the convoy sharply enough, at a time when the U-boats were repositioning for attack, and the geometry collapsed. The firing solutions became worthless. The contact reports went astray. Boats that had crept ahead to intercept found nothing but empty sea. It was, in practice, a duel of timing. The U-boats attempted to anticipate. The escorts attempted to break that anticipation. The sea, the wind, and the darkness blurred the picture for both sides. By early 1943, these lessons had seeped deeply into British and Canadian escort culture. Reports from earlier convoy battles noted that violent alterations, a phrase repeated with understated regularity, had saved convoys during the worst moments of Wolfpack attacks. These were not impulsive maneuvers, they were calculated acts, rooted in hard-won experience and often supported by the thin threads of intelligence arriving from shore. And so, when an escort captain stood on his bridge and considered a turn that would look reckless to any casual observer, he did so against the backdrop of this evolving doctrine. The Wolfpacks remained deadly, the weather remained merciless, but the escorts, by now, possessed the confidence to challenge the predictability on which the U-boats depended. That tension between risk and necessity, between the urge to hold course and the need to break free, shaped every night convoy battle in the mid-ocean. Is within this tense strategic, that landscape that the captain's crazy turn must be understood. If the Wolfpacks defined the threat, the escorts defined the resistance. These were not large wartime formations, but compact, highly trained groups, destroyers, corvettes, and later frigates welded together through months of hard weather, endless drills, and the shared responsibility of keeping a convoy alive. Each escort group had its own rhythm, its own instincts, and often its own quietly respected personalities, captains who understood the sea, the machinery, and the fine balance between boldness and caution. At the center of this system stood the senior officer escort, whose flagship controlled the screen's disposition. But individual escort captains had considerable autonomy. The ocean was too vast, the battles too fluid, for every decision to be relayed through higher authority. A ship detecting a radar contact on the beam could not wait for consultation. It turned out, increased speed, and moved to intercept. A corvette receiving a faint Aztec echo could not pause to debate. Its commanding officer ordered a depth charge pattern almost instinctively. These instincts, however, did not develop in isolation. They were shaped by the Western Approach's tactical unit in Liverpool, a place that became in many respects the intellectual heart of Britain's anti-submarine campaign. Inside a series of windowless rooms, officers stood around large gridded tables, using model ships and chalk marks to recreate convoy battles. They tested hypotheses, refought engagements, and explored scenarios that would later unfold upon the Atlantic itself. The atmosphere was calm, analytical, and relentless. When mistakes appeared, they were examined without sentiment. When solutions emerged, they were distilled into doctrine and carried back to the fleet. Among the most important lessons was the recognition that U-boats relied not only on torpedo accuracy but on predicting where the convoy would be. A steady track gave the Wolfpack a stable target. An unexpected alteration pulled the rug from under their geometry. Tactical games demonstrated that the moment of greatest danger, when several U-boats were closing from multiple directions, was often the moment when a radical change of course had the best chance of success. It forced the attackers to reorient, broke the cohesion of the pack, and bought the escorts time to reorganize. The technology available to the escorts further reinforced this approach. Radar improved steadily as the war progressed, allowing surface contacts at increasing ranges. HFDF sets aboard escorts and merchantmen provided bearings on U-boat transmissions, revealing patterns that, when plotted carefully, warned of converging packs, and whether that vast and uncontrollable factor often served as an ally. A convoy caught within a squall line, masked by heavy seas, could vanish from the U-boats, limited visibility at the very moment of course. Alteration threw off their approach calculations. Yet none of this guaranteed safety. Even with better equipment and sharper doctrine, the escorts understood that they were fighting a thinking enemy. The U-boat arm adapted quickly. Commanders used the surface to maintain high speed, slipping in and out of radar shadows created by rough seas. They coordinated their movements with terse radio messages, using the minimum transmission time to limit HFDF accuracy. Some waited patiently on the convoy's far beam, others crept ahead to form a trap, and some attempted bold night surface runs down the columns themselves. For the escorts, maintaining the screen under such pressure demanded discipline bordering on the severe. Every ship in the convoy had to hold station in darkness, trusting the officer on the bridge and the helmsman at the wheel. A single vessel turning too slowly, or drifting from its assigned column, could cause a chain reaction of confusion. The escorts watched constantly for any sign of disorder, a merchantman lagging astern, a lamp signaling difficulty, a column bunching under the influence of wind or sea state. Against this background, the decision to order a sharp turn was never taken lightly. The escort captain weighed the risks, the sea's height, the convoy's spacing, the condition of the slower merchantmen, and the fatigue of crews who had already endured long hours on the bridge. But he also weighed the cold numbers of survival. A Wolfpack preparing to attack had its own momentum. Break that momentum at the critical moment, and the convoy might slip past the danger, fail to act, and the next 20 minutes could bring torpedo tracks gliding silently between the columns. By 1943, this balance between risk, doctrine, and the instincts developed through months of naval chess on the Atlantic shaped every major convoy defense. It was here, in this crucible of pressure and calculation, that the crazy turn emerged not as recklessness but as a refined instrument of survival. It represented the convergence of training, technology, weather sense, and the understated determination that ran through the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy during the darkest years of the war. Within this evolving tactical world, escort captains knew that a single decisive alteration of course could mean the difference between a convoy shattered and a convoy saved. The sea offered no guarantees, only opportunities, fleeting and perilous, waiting to be seized in the space between one wave crest and the next. Every convoy battle began and ended with ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances. On the bridge of an escort, the atmosphere was a mixture of discipline and quiet strain. Officers worked in red light to preserve their night vision, their eyes adjusting constantly between the chart table, the compass repeater, and the black windswept horizon. The cold penetrated everything. Gloves stiffened, oilskins froze at the seams, binoculars became difficult to hold in the gale dot below. The engine room was a world of heat and noise. The men working there rarely saw the weather that battered the ship, but they felt its consequences in every shudder and roll. A sudden alteration, of course, sent pressure changes through the boilers and turbines, forcing the engine room crew to react instantly to maintain revolutions. The physical labor was relentless, and the knowledge that any misstep on the surface could bring a torpedo into their compartment was never far from mind. On the gun platforms, lookouts faced the sea directly. Spray lashed their faces. The cold soaked through layers of wool. These men had to detect the faintest disturbance, a wave that moved incorrectly, a flicker of phosphorescence trailing behind a conning tower. Their vigilance formed the outer edge of the convoy's defense. In such conditions, time blurred. Nights stretched into a single unbroken vigil. A crazy turn was not merely a tactical shift. It was something felt physically by every sailor. The ship heeled, unsecured items slid across decks, and men braced themselves against bulkheads. Yet despite fatigue, they obeyed instantly. The trust in their captains, judgment shaped by experience rather than rhetoric, held firm. This was the human canvas upon which every tactical decision was painted. The U-boat threat was rooted in mathematics as much as in torpedoes. A convoy was a moving target, identifiable by its heading, speed, and predictable pattern. Once a Wolfpack established these variables, often by shadowing on the surface or positions through brief radio transmissions, the convoy's fate depended on whether it remained on track long enough for the pack to attack in concert. Escort captains understood this. Every convoy followed a master zigzag plan, designed to complicate enemy calculations, but these routine alterations were rarely enough to defeat a coordinated approach. A Wolfpack adapted, boats shifted outward, positioned ahead of the convoy, and waited for the columns to arrive. A radical turn shattered this geometry. A 60 to 90 degree alteration, executed at the moment when several U-boats were converging from different bearings, forced the entire pack into disarray. Boats moving to intercept arrived at empty sea. Those preparing to attack from astern found themselves misaligned. Others, attempting to shadow, lost vital visual contact in the dark or behind a squall. Convoy reports from 194243 repeatedly noted the effectiveness of such maneuvers. Descriptions such as extreme course alteration, violent turn, or drastic evasion appeared in the understated language of post-action summaries. These were not improvisations. They were the application of convoy tactics tested at the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, where wargames demonstrated repeatedly that the greatest opportunity lay in disrupting the U-boat's timing rather than attempting to destroy every attacker. In practice, the crazy turn was the most powerful weapon available to an escort leader, a method of erasing the enemy's assumptions in a single, controlled moment. The mid-war period saw rapid advances in British and Canadian anti-submarine technology. Radar sets fitted to escorts provided early warning of surfaced U-boats, though their effectiveness varied with sea state and atmospheric conditions. A small contact on the beam, a momentary flicker on the screen could indicate a U-boat running at speed to gain position for attack. Such glimpses, fleeting though they were, informed the captain's judgment. HFDF high-frequency direction finding transformed the broader picture. U-boats coordinating with their command or with each other transmitted short, coded messages. These signals, intercepted by shore stations or, increasingly, by HFDF sets aboard escorts, produced bearings that, when plotted over time, revealed the growing arc of a wolf. Even a handful of such bearings, arriving hours earlier, shaped the escort leader's sense of danger as night approached. Weather added another layer. The North Atlantic's habitual storms, fog banks, and squall lines disrupted both sides. A U-boat conning tower could vanish entirely behind a ridge of black water. Rain cluttered radar screens. High seas forced boats to reduce surface speed, making shadowing more difficult. Escort captains learned to read these conditions as carefully as any instrument. If a squall approached from one quarter, and HFDF bearings suggested U-boats closing from another, a sharp turn executed within that moment of reduced visibility could be decisive. The technology never provided certainty. It offered fragments of bearing here, a faint echo there, which had to be woven together with seamanship and tactical experience. In this sense, the crazy turn was not blind instinct but the culmination of 1,000 small signals, human and mechanical. interpreted under the pressure of approaching danger. Behind every convoy battle lay a chain of decisions, shaped by information that most sailors never saw. At Bletchley Park, mathematicians, linguists, and analysts worked through the night to extract meaning from intercepted German naval traffic. When U-boat groups were shifted, when patrol lines were adjusted, or when contact reports passed through the Enigma network, these fragments flowed into Admiralty assessments. Not all messages were decrypted in time to influence events at sea, but enough reached Western Approach's command to improve the broad understanding of Wolfpack movements in Liverpool. Western Approach's officers combined decrypts with HFDF bearings, air reconnaissance, and previous convoy reports to produce daily estimates of U-boat concentrations. These estimates guided the routing of convoys, sometimes diverting them by hundreds of miles to avoid patrol lines, yet the information never reached the bridge in perfect form. Transmission delays, changing weather, and the rapid movement of U-boats meant that by the time an escort captain received a signal warning of possible danger, the reality at sea might already have shifted. This imperfect but invaluable flow of intelligence created a tension familiar to every escort leader. He knew the broad pattern: Wolfpacks were operating somewhere ahead, or to windward or on the beam, but he could not rely on the signals alone. He had to merge them with what he observed: the radar flicker, the unexpected HFDF bearing from his own ship, the behavior of the sea, the instinct honed over previous battles. Thus, when he ordered a drastic turn, he was often acting on a convergence of clues: intelligence from shore, signals filtered through higher command, and the immediate tactical pattern unfolding around him. The unseen work at Bletchley Park and Western Approaches did not prescribe the turn, but it created the framework in which such a decision made sense. Convoy battles demanded a form of leadership that rested not on rhetoric but on quiet judgment. Escort captains carried a responsibility that extended far beyond their own crews. Each convoy might contain 40, 50, or 60 merchant ships, tankers, freighters, colliers, carrying the materials Britain required simply to endure. Every decision, from a minor zigzag to a dramatic alteration of course, affected thousands of lives. In the rigid hierarchy of naval warfare, captains nonetheless operated in an environment that rewarded flexibility. A textbook approach rarely survived contact with the sea. Heavy weather degraded radar performance, ice accreted on superstructures, shifting ships off trim. Merchant vessels, some older and slower than others, struggled to match the convoy's rhythm. Leadership in these conditions required calm, assessment, and a willingness to act decisively when the tactical picture turned. Ambiguous post-action reports often captured this. Leadership in the most understated phrases. A captain might write that conditions suggested a sharp alteration of course was prudent, or that enemy disposition indicated probable interception on present heading. Behind such phrasing lay a moment of genuine pressure, taken under darkness, fatigue, and uncertainty. These decisions were not always perfect. Some convoys turned too early, others too late, and on occasion a radical turn led to temporary disorder within the merchant columns. But the hallmark of effective leadership was the ability to judge when the risks of inaction outweighed the risks of maneuver. A crazy turn, as it might appear to an inexperienced observer, that often reflected the cumulative experience of dozens of previous battles, the knowledge that U-boats depended on predicting the convoy's behavior, and that breaking that prediction, even at some internal cost, might be the convoy's only path to survival. While escort ships executed turns with trained precision, the experience within the merchant columns was markedly different. The merchant navy was composed of civilian sailors operating under wartime conditions. Their ships varied widely, some fast and modern, others slow and aging, with crews who had endured months at sea under constant threat. They followed the convoy commodore's signals dutifully. But every major turn brought challenges of its own. Darkness, a convoy's formation was maintained through discipline and routine. Each master held station by reference to the faint silhouette of the ship ahead and the glow of a dimmed stern lamp. When an emergency turn was executed, the commodore signaled it by lamp or radio, but the physical reality lagged behind the intention. A large merchant ship took time to answer her helm, especially in heavy weather. A sudden 60 to 90 degree alteration put immediate strain on the slower vessels, which struggled to maintain alignment. Some ships overshot the turn, others swung wide. A few required additional helm to counteract the sea. Officers on the bridge kept their nerves steady, calling out bearings, adjusting engine revolutions, and watching anxiously for any vessel drifting across their path. The helmsman felt the ship lean heavily into the sea's force, holding her through the roll as waves broke over the forecastle. Yet despite the difficulty, the merchant navy adapted with remarkable resilience. These sailors understood that the escort's decisions, even the abrupt ones, were taken to preserve the convoy as a whole. They accepted the discomfort, the temporary confusion, and the physical effort required to keep station because they recognized the alternative: remaining on a predictable heading long enough for the Wolfpack to find its range. In this way, the crazy turn was not only a tactical maneuver, but a collective act of endurance, shared among every ship in the convoy. The night that shaped the convoy's fate began without spectacle. The sea was heavy but manageable, the wind steady from the southwest, and visibility broken by long banks of cloud sweeping across the horizon. Shortly after dusk, the first hints of danger appeared not through a single dramatic contact, but through a pattern of small, easily overlooked signs that, when taken together, revealed a Wolfpack closing. The HFDF set aboard the Escort flagship produced a bearing on a short U-boat signal, transmitted somewhere to starboard. Minutes later, a second bearing arrived from another escort, this time slightly aft of the first. Neither could be plotted with precision, but the alignment was enough to suggest movement. At least 2 boats, perhaps more, edging into position. The escorts knew what this meant. A U-boat rarely operated alone at night on the surface in those waters. A single sighting or bearing often marked the forward edge of a group preparing to attack. Then a radar operator on a destroyer stationed on the convoy's starboard beam reported a momentary return, a contact that appeared and vanished within seconds. Sea clutter could explain it. So could the rise and fall of the ship's own motion. Yet the timing aligned too closely with the HFDF bearings to be ignored. The escort leader ordered the destroyer to investigate, increasing speed to try to regain the contact. The destroyer surged into the dark, bow pounding against the waves, radar antenna sweeping steadily across the night. For a short time, nothing further developed. The convoy held its standard zigzag, the columns rising and falling rhythmically. But the calm was deceptive. In the darkness beyond visual range, at least 3 U-boats had taken up their positions. One had been shadowing since late afternoon, using the last of the light to track the convoy's silhouette. The others, guided not by precise signals but by the approximate bearing and estimated speed of the convoy, had moved into the triangle from which night attacks were traditionally launched. Shortly after 2,300 hours, the situation sharpened. A merchantman in the outer starboard column reported a distant explosion. Faint, absorbed by wind and sea. No hit was confirmed, and the escort suspected a premature torpedo detonation, a known occurrence in rough water. But the explosion served as another warning. A torpedo had been fired. Somewhere close enough to reach its target had conditions been different. The escort leader convened a rapid assessment. He had no luxury of time or perfect information. The convoy was entering the period when Wolfpack attacks historically intensified. Late evening, when visibility was poor and merchantmen were settling into the long hours before midnight. A slow tightening of the noose could be felt, not through continuous contact, but through the rhythm of the reports, a bearing here, an explosion there, a radar flicker. A lookout on one escort claiming to see a shape that vanished before confirmation. It was in this atmosphere, shaped by ambiguity and pressure, that the crucial moment approached. A second destroyer, screening ahead of the convoy, signaled a weak radar contact fine on the starboard bow. Again, it vanished almost immediately, but its bearing corresponded with the earlier HFDF lines. This suggested the forward element of the Wolfpack was now in place. The U-boats were forming a loose, invisible arc designed to channel the convoy straight into their firing positions. The escort leader studied the chart. The convoy's present course, if maintained, would take it directly into the expected intersection point. He knew the pattern well. A U-boat ahead, forcing the convoy toward boats on the beam and quarter. It was the classic geometry of a mid-ocean Wolfpack attack. He also knew the limits of time. If the convoy waited for clear confirmation, a periscope sighting, a torpedo wake, an unmistakable radar return, it would already be too late. The Wolfpack relied on this hesitation. It counted on the convoy holding course long enough for the boats to complete their approach. The escort leader closed the chart and walked to the bridge wing. The wind struck hard, carrying spray from the cresting waves. Somewhere in the darkness, 3 or 4 U-boats were adjusting to the convoy's current speed and heading, preparing to close the distance necessary to fire torpedoes into the columns. A sharp alteration now would be dangerous. The sea state alone posed risks for the older merchant ships. Some were already laboring. Others struggled to maintain formation when the wind shifted. But keeping the present course was more dangerous still. A crazy turn, the kind that broke the U-boat's geometry, was the only realistic option. At 2,318 hours, the order was given. The convoy would execute a major alteration of course to port, far greater than any routine zigzag. The signal lamps flashed. The helmsmen aboard dozens of merchant ships spun their wheels. The escorts surged outward to reposition the screen as the darkened fleet began its slow, deliberate swing into the wind and sea. In that moment, the convoy's fate hung on whether the turn had been timed with sufficient precision, early enough to evade the pack's approach, but late enough to ensure that the U-boats had already committed themselves. The next minutes would reveal whether the decision had drawn the convoy out of danger, or deeper into it. The first consequence of the turn was internal. The convoy, 80,000 tons of scattered silhouettes, had to reshape itself in darkness. Merchantmen heeled as they answered their helms. Some responded quickly, their bows biting sharply into the sea. Others lagged, heavy with cargo and sluggish in the swell. Columns that had held steady alignment now bent like reeds in the wind. the neat geometry shifting as each ship interpreted the turn through its own machinery, momentum, and handling. Escorts moved immediately to stabilize the formation. A destroyer on the starboard beam increased speed to sweep wide, guarding the exposed quarter. Corvettes astern adjusted to close the gap left by the convoy's swing. On the port side, another destroyer angled inward to ensure no merchantman drifted too far outward under the strain of the maneuver. The escort screen, trained by months of tactical drills, adapted with a precision born from necessity. Beyond the convoy's perimeter, the Wolfpack reacted with confusion. U-boats approaching on the starboard bow expected the convoy to continue on its original heading. They had maneuvered throughout the previous hour to ensure favorable attack angles. Their commanders, working by dead reckoning, rough estimated positions, and occasional visual glimpses of moving mastheads, believed they had correctly aligned their runs. Instead, they found empty water. One U, having crept forward on the surface to lie ahead of the convoy, suddenly discovered that its carefully chosen interception point had drifted astern. The dark shape of the leading column, expected to emerge from the gloom, never appeared. The captain scanned the horizon repeatedly, but the swell and worsening visibility gave him little reference. He ordered a change of course and increased revolutions, but the convoy had already moved beyond his immediate reach furthest. Another U-boat preparing for an attack down the convoy's starboard side encountered the altered geometry even more abruptly. Its commander slowed momentarily to refine his approach. That hesitation, measured in seconds, proved decisive. The convoy's radical turn meant the columns were now angling away, forcing the U-boat into an awkward pursuit. For a surfaced boat relying on speed and timing, losing the initiative to a sudden change in target heading was crippling. A third U, positioned abaft the beam, attempted to regain contact by transmitting a short contact report. The signal was barely 3 seconds long, a brief burst intended to minimize HFDF accuracy, yet even such a fleeting transmission was enough. 2 escorts, equipped with shipborne HFDF sets, took rough bearings, while imprecise the lines intersected behind the convoy's new heading. This suggested that at least one boat had overshot the convoy's wake entirely for the Wolfpack. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Their cohesive pattern, so meticulously constructed through hours of shadowing and repositioning, unraveled. Boats that had counted on predictable movement found themselves misaligned. Those attempting to regain the convoy's track now moved at cross angles, searching in darkness for a formation no longer where logic suggested it should be. The sea compounded the difficulty. A squall, rolling in from the port quarter, swept across the area shortly after the turn. Rain battered the surface, flattening visibility. Wind-driven spray obscured what little light remained. Radar performance varied wildly. Scattered reflections, clutter, and the heavy sea state made it nearly impossible for U-boats to maintain contact from beyond close range. Within the escort group, the turn's success became clearer as minutes passed without a confirmed sighting. Radar operators reported nothing ahead or on the new beam. Lookouts strained their eyes but saw only black water rising and falling. The ASDIC set sent out their rhythmical pings, returning no immediate contacts. The convoy, though not yet safe, was no longer within the killing geometry the Wolfpack had prepared. By midnight, the escorts compiled their assessments. The U-boats had not followed the convoy's new course with sufficient cohesion. Individual boats might still pose a threat, but the orchestrated, multi-directional attack, the hallmark of a Wolfpack, had been broken. The convoy, which hours earlier had been within the jaws of a converging pack, now moved on a track that placed it several miles clear of the anticipated interception point. The success did not come without strain. Some merchantmen had difficulty returning precisely to station after the turn. A collier in the rear columns drifted slightly off alignment, requiring careful steering to avoid falling behind. The escort spent the next hour shepherding these ships back into proper formation. A destroyer made a quick sweep astern, dropping a depth charge pattern on a suspected contact, perhaps a genuine echo, perhaps an artifact of the sea. The explosion rolled across the water, briefly illuminating the spray before darkness reclaimed the horizon. But the broader picture was unmistakable. The crazy turn, violent by convoy standards, risky in weather like this, had achieved its purpose. It had forced the Wolfpack to reposition, disrupted the converging pattern of approach, and pushed the convoy clear of the danger area during the most vulnerable period of the night. By 00 for 5 hours, the escorts reported the sea behind them empty of enemy indications. The HFDF sets aboard the flagship captured no new transmissions within dangerous bearings. What U-boats remained in the vicinity were dislocated, uncertain, struggling to regain the track of a target that had rewritten the geometry of the engagement. The convoy pressed on, its formation tightening once more into steady lines. Spray continued to sweep across the bows. The night remained cold and unsettled, but the immediate threat had passed. A decision taken in darkness, grounded in judgment, training, and the accumulated intelligence of many battles had carried the convoy through the Wolfpack's most dangerous hour. The turning point had come not through the destruction of the enemy, but through the denial of his timing. In the mathematics of the Atlantic, That was often enough to save lives. By the early hours of dawn, the convoy had settled into a steadier rhythm. The sea remained restless, its long Atlantic swell lifting and dropping each ship in slow, heavy movements. But the sense of imminent crisis had eased. The crazy turn, the decisive swing that carried the formation out of the Wolfpack's alignment, had not eliminated danger entirely, yet it had fractured the coordinated assault that had threatened to fall upon the convoy during the night's darkest hours. As gray light seeped across the horizon, the escorts began their first systematic assessment. Each ship reported in, describing its condition, the status of its equipment, and any events of the night that might not have been captured in the rapid exchanges during the engagement. These post-action reports, delivered in the understated language typical of the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy, formed the backbone of the Admiralty's understanding of each convoy battle. Several merchantmen noted the strain of the turn. A few ships had taken on water through ventilators or hatches when the sudden heel drove spray across their decks. One freighter recorded minor structural stresses in its forward plating, likely induced by the combination of cargo weight and the abrupt course change in heavy seas. None reported damage from collision, a testament to the discipline with which the merchants and escorts executed the maneuver. The escort's findings were equally revealing. A destroyer on the starboard sweep had detected what may have been a U-boat echo shortly after the turn, prompting a depth charge attack. The explosion produced no confirmed result but served its purpose. It discouraged any surviving attacker from attempting a daring close-range approach. Another escort, stationed astern, reported seeing a periscope or snorkel wake momentarily in the half-light just before dawn. The sighting was unconfirmed, but such ambiguous moments were common in the North Atlantic, fleeting impressions shaped by exhaustion, sea state, and the difficulty of distinguishing genuine threats from natural disturbances. No torpedo hits were recorded following the convoy's drastic alteration, and no merchantmen reported evasive maneuvers prompted by nearby deck. This absence of further attack provided the strongest evidence of the maneuver's success. A Wolfpack coordinated closely enough to launch a multi-vector assault would typically press its advantage until fuel, weather, or counterattack forced a withdrawal. The silence following the turn indicated that the U-boats had lost their geometry and were now operating blind, scattered across miles of dark, turbulent sea. Yet the aftermath was not measured solely in the absence of losses. The physical and emotional toll on crews, both naval and merchant, was considerable. Escort captains and bridge teams had worked through most of the night without rest, balancing the demands of seamanship, tactical judgment, and the ceaseless strain of maintaining vigilance in poor visibility. In the engine rooms, stokers and mechanics endured hours of punishing labor as revolutions rose and fell during the maneuver and subsequent screen adjustments. Sleep came in fragments, often interrupted by alarms, bearings, or shifts in sea conditions. Within the merchant columns, fatigue took a quieter form. Many sailors had spent the night at action stations, hands gripping cold metal rails whenever the ship swung heavily into the waves. They were civilians operating in military formation, yet their discipline remained resolute. Their ability to maintain station even under a violent turn reflected months of practice, as well as the sober realization that cohesion was the convoy's most important defense. As the morning progressed, the convoy commodore compiled the initial narrative of the night's events. His report would travel through naval channels to Western Approaches Command, where analysts would cross-reference it with intelligence, HFDF logs, and any known U-boat signals from the period. The turn, its timing, and its consequences would be studied with the same clinical care applied to every convoy battle. Lessons would be extracted, not only the success, but the stresses placed upon certain ships, the behavior of the screen, and the manner in which the U-boats responded. This was the quiet aftermath of a night in which hundreds of lives had depended upon a single decision. The convoy was still days from landfall, still vulnerable to isolated threats, still at the mercy of weather and chance, but the worst danger had passed. The Wolfpack's orchestrated attack had been broken, and the convoy, scattered briefly, strained but intact, continued its long passage across the Atlantic. As the day advanced and the convoy settled into its post-engagement routine, the wider significance of the night's events began to emerge. Convoys rarely experienced Wolfpack attacks in isolation. Each action formed part of a continuous strategic contest stretching from the French Biscay ports to the Western Approaches, where British and Canadian escorts fought not merely to defend a single formation, but to reduce the overall effectiveness of the U-boat arm. In London and Liverpool, analysts would later study signals intelligence revealing that several U-boats in the vicinity had transmitted brief, frustrated contact reports shortly after dawn. Their positions, when plotted with known convoy routes, showed the consequences of the disruption. Some boats were dozens of miles from the convoy's true track. Others had searched fruitlessly through the squalls and rising seas, expecting to sight the columns on the original heading. A few, misled by the convoy's altered course, maneuvered into areas where weather conditions entirely obscured visibility. The cohesion of the pack, so carefully constructed the previous afternoon, had been lost. For the U-boat commanders, the night represented a familiar pattern of disappointment. They had achieved partial contact, only for the target to slip out of reach through a combination of weather, escort action, and unpredictable maneuver. The German Naval War Diaries often described such encounters as missed opportunities or broken attacks, terms that understated the psychological toll of repeated failures. A U-boat crew lived in confined conditions, often enduring weeks of patrol for a handful of fleeting moments in which an attack was possible. When those moments evaporated, as they often did after a convoy executed a well-timed turn, the sense of anticlimax was profound. From the Allied perspective, the aftermath involved more than relief. It demanded learning. Western Approach's command examined each engagement with unwavering discipline. Analysts compared the convoy's movement with intercepted U-boat signals, scrutinized how the escorts repositioned during the turn, and assessed the internal cohesion of the columns. If a particular merchantman struggled to maintain station, that detail was recorded. If the escorts demonstrated an effective counter-screen maneuver, that too was noted. The crazy turn itself, though described calmly in official paperwork, became a tactical reference point to be replayed in war games, teaching future officers the subtleties of timing and risk. This culture of continuous refinement reflected a broader shift in the Atlantic War. By 1943, the Allies had begun to integrate intelligence, technology, training, and operational reports into a coherent system. Each convoy battle fed into that system, shaping future decisions. A single night's survival contributed to the cumulative degradation of Wolfpack efficiency. Every disrupted attack forced U-boats to consume fuel, reposition, or risk dangerous surface movement during daylight hours, conditions increasingly perilous as Allied air cover expanded. On board the convoy's ships. However, these strategic implications remained overshadowed by the practical realities of the sea. The crew's concerns were immediate: clearing the decks of ice and spray, repairing minor damage, adjusting cargo lashings strained by the turn, and restoring normal watch routines. Fatigue hung over the men like a physical weight. The knowledge that the convoy had survived a major threat brought quiet satisfaction, but no celebration. In the North Atlantic, survival was never final. Another Wolfpack could be waiting further west. Another storm could be approaching. Another night could bring the same tense rhythm of bearings, echoes, and indistinct shapes on the horizon. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The escorts, reviewing their charts and logs, understood that the night's success was not luck. It reflected an evolution in Allied thinking, a realization that the convoy was not a passive target, but a dynamic formation capable of outmaneuvering a pack that relied on predictable patterns. The fishermen, merchant officers, naval reservists, and career sailors who manned these ships knew that the ocean itself remained the greatest adversary, yet they also knew that the war at sea was turning toward them, slowly but decisively in time. When the convoy sighted the first aircraft from the western approaches or received signals indicating it had entered safer waters, the events of the night would recede into memory. The log extracts, the HFDF bearings, and the terse notes from the escort leader would form part of the official record. But among the crews, the memory took a quieter form, the shared recognition that, in the darkness of the mid-ocean, discipline, training, and a single bold decision had preserved the convoy's fragile chain of life. The aftermath was not triumph. It was continuity, the steady, determined carrying forward of Britain's lifeline. One convoy at a time. The night's events, viewed from the calmer distance of history, reveal the true character of the Atlantic War. It was never simply a contest of ships against submarines, nor one of weapons against countermeasures. It was a struggle shaped by judgment, endurance, and the narrow margin between order and collapse. A convoy crossing the mid-ocean moved through a world defined by uncertainty. The sea hid friend and foe alike. Radar flickered unreliably in heavy weather. Aztec pulses echoed through layers of cold water, returning fragments that required interpretation rather than blind faith. Intelligence from Bletchley Park and Western approaches offered guidance but never clarity. In this environment, every tactical success rested on people, their training, their patience, and their willingness to act when the moment demanded it. The crazy turn, at first glance a reckless swerve across the ocean, was in truth a distilled expression of Allied learning. It captured the essence of Britain's maritime defense, a refusal to be predictable, a readiness to accept calculated risk, and a quiet confidence that came from months of study and practice. It spoke not of bravado, but of composure. The escorts did not seek glory. They sought survival for the convoy, and through it, survival for the nation. For the merchant navy, whose ships carried the weight of Britain's hopes across the Atlantic, such decisions were accepted without ceremony. Their resilience, often unrecorded, rarely celebrated, formed the steady heartbeat of the convoy system. They endured cold, fatigue, and the strain of maneuvers that tested their ships to the limit. Yet they held station because they understood that cohesion was the foundation of their collective safety. In the end, the night belonged not to dramatic victories or the destruction of the enemy, but to the preservation of life. The Wolfpack was not defeated in a single blow. It was worn down by countless moments like this one. By escorts who interpreted faint signals in the dark, by captains who trusted their instincts, and by crews who carried out difficult orders with unassuming resolve. The Battle of the Atlantic turned not on grand gestures, but on decisions made in cold wind and darkness, far from any shore. Among those decisions, a single crazy turn, measured, timed, and carried out with unwavering discipline, stands as a reminder of how thin the line of Britain's lifeline truly was, and how steadfastly it was defended.